A black man in a suit was slammed to the ground by courthouse officers minutes before he was meant to preside as the judge inside. They saw a threat where there was only authority and acted on bias instead of facts. But when Judge Ellison took the bench with the bruise still fresh, he used the law itself to hold them accountable. And just listen to how this quiet act of justice turned the whole system on its head, and why fairness, in the end, prevailed. The morning outside Riverton County Courthouse was ordinary. Fog lifting from the concrete, the scent of wet stone blending with burnt espresso from the corner cart. Commuters moved in familiar rhythms, briefcases in one hand, phone screens in the other. Somewhere behind all of it, the system was waking up. Judges, attorneys, clerks, officers, all converging in quiet anticipation of the day's legal battles. It was a morning designed to go unnoticed. Marcus Ellison stepped out of a gray rideshare sedan, dressed in a fitted charcoal suit and carrying a slim leather folio. No robe, no staff, no indication that he was the person whose name was engraved on the courtroom plaque 3 floors up. To anyone watching, he looked like just another citizen trying to find his way, unremarkable, except for the fact that he was black and walking alone toward the courthouse. Officers Travis Cole and Hank Delaney stood at the base of the courthouse steps, leaning near a cruiser that hadn't moved all morning. The two had been monitoring a dispatcher's call about suspicious loitering, a vague report, thin on specifics, likely just another non-event in a list of morning dispatch noise. But their precinct had been under pressure lately. A string of car break-ins near the municipal lot had the captain issuing daily reminders. Be visible, be proactive, no complacency. It was Cole who took that personally. Still reeling from a misconduct complaint filed weeks earlier, he was itching for a moment to demonstrate initiative, to prove that he still had control of the street. As Marcus approached the building, he paused briefly at the base of the steps, checking his phone for courtroom updates, then glancing toward the entrance. To Cole and Delaney, the hesitation read differently. It wasn't a pause for orientation. It was doubt, calculation, a red flag. Cole nudged Delaney. "That our guy?" "Matches the call," Delaney muttered. "No time to wait. Let's move." Marcus didn't see them approach until they were close, too close for it to be casual. He looked up from his phone just as Cole called out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" "Excuse me?" Marcus replied, confused. "You loitering? Show me your ID." There was no clear reason for the stop, but Cole's tone didn't allow room for questions. Marcus, startled but composed, tried to explain. "I work in the building. Before he could finish, the exchange escalated. Cole took a step forward, closing the distance. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus lifted his hand slightly, stunned by the speed of it. Listen, I work here. I'm on the docket this morning." The command came sharp. "Turn around, now." Marcus, still not fully understanding what was happening, turned. Delaney moved in from behind. In an instant, protocol blurred. What should have been a moment of verification, a name, a badge scan, a call to the front desk, turned physical. Marcus was pushed forward. One hand was pulled behind his back, then the other. His folio dropped to the concrete, papers spilling into the gutter. A knee pressed into his spine hard. His cheek scraped against the cold granite step, landing in a shallow puddle left from last night's rain. In the rippled surface of the water, fragments of courthouse columns, sky, and blue uniformed knees reflected in broken symmetry. "I work here," Marcus said again, breath strained. "You're making a mistake." Delaney heard the words. He noted them, but dismissed them as noise. He'd heard that line too many times from too many suspects in too many identical situations. In his head, everyone worked here once they hit the ground. People nearby had stopped. Someone began filming. A woman clutched her briefcase to her chest and pulled out her phone. An intern in a suit jacket whispered to a colleague, "What is going on?" A courthouse security guard inside the glass doors caught a glimpse and then looked away. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was fatigue, maybe it was fear of stepping into a mess that might stain more than just a shift. Inside the building, a clerk named Benji was sipping the last of his coffee, wondering if Judge Ellison had slept at all after yesterday's docket. He didn't look up, didn't see the man he chatted with just yesterday, now bleeding quietly on the sidewalk just outside. No alarm sounded. No one ran to stop it. The moment passed in brutal silence, except for the rustle of a plastic evidence bag and the low murmur of confused bystanders. What had started as a morning like any other had collapsed into something else. A scene too familiar and too fast to interrupt. A routine misread. A presumption left unchallenged. A power dynamic drawn in permanent ink. As Marcus was lifted from the ground, wrists cuffed, face damp and bruised, one thing burned in the eyes of those watching. Not just the violence of the act, but the casual way it had unfolded. The ease, how quickly authority was weaponized, and how suddenly a man's dignity could be stripped away, without shouting, without weapons, without a single raised voice. Just uniforms, assumptions, and a silence that had learned how to look the other way. The holding room smelled of dust and plastic, the kind of sterile emptiness that made time feel stretched and distorted. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in the same pale, uneven glow. The walls, the floor, the people. There were no windows, just a bolted bench, a metal table, and the faint hum of a distant copier somewhere on the other side of a cinder block wall. Marcus sat alone. He was still in his suit, though it looked less like a symbol of authority now, and more like evidence in a case no one would bother to file. The collar was twisted, one button gone, and a faint stain bloomed across his shirt where rainwater and street grit had soaked through the fabric. He rolled his jaw slowly, pressing his tongue to the inside of his cheek where a thin cut stung with the sharp taste of blood and rust. He didn't wince. He just noted it, another entry in a ledger too long to forget. He had written parts of the courthouse security protocol himself. He remembered the exact paragraph that outlined identification checks. He'd argued in a long meeting 6 months ago that plainclothes judges should be granted verified access through courthouse staff. But protocols only mattered when people chose to follow them. And today, someone had made a different choice. That knowledge, more than the bruises, throbbed beneath his skin. Outside the room, Officers Cole and Delaney stood near the desk, one filling out a use-of-force report on a department-issued tablet, the other watching the hallway like it might attack. Cole was still flushed, the adrenaline making his hand jitter slightly as he tapped through forms. He'd memorized the wording from policy. Reasonable suspicion based on observed behavior consistent with recent bolo. It sounded cleaner than it had felt, more official, like something he could explain if anyone asked. Delaney, by contrast, looked everywhere but at the room where Marcus sat. His foot tapped the linoleum in quiet, steady rhythm, nerves disguised as routine. His mind flashed back to training. Better to explain over coffee than over a eulogy, a field sergeant had told him once. That logic had calcified over time, hardened into reflex. A man pauses near a government building, doesn't answer quickly enough, fits a loose description. Sometimes that's all it takes. That was how they lived with it. Neither of them had woken up planning to detain a judge, but neither had paused long enough to imagine it might be a possibility. And so now, paperwork would become their shield, protocol their cover. They would submit the incident up the chain, wait for statements, review footage, and talk to internal affairs like it was just another Tuesday. Because in their version of events, it almost was. But for Marcus Ellison, this wasn't just another Tuesday. This was a collision between lived truth and institutional habit. A reminder that for some people, credentials are protection. For others, they are just words.
He'd been the first too many times. First black editor of the Law Review, first black partner at his old firm, first black judge appointed in Riverton in over a decade. And yet, none of that had spoken louder than the color of his skin when he stood on those steps. This was not new pain. It was familiar. It had just returned in a new uniform. He shifted on the bench, wrists still sore from the cuffs, and stared at the far wall where an old calendar curled at the corners. He wondered how many others had sat in this exact room, trying to remember that they were more than what someone assumed. Wondered how many people had tried to speak reason when no one was listening. A door opened with a faint creak. A deputy leaned inside. Tall, mid-40s, the kind of man who knew everyone's name and had forgotten how to care about any of them. He glanced at Marcus with a raised brow, chewing something with slow indifference. "I need to make my docket," Marcus said, voice level. The deputy paused, not because of what Marcus said, but because of how he said it. Calm, precise, educated, too measured for this room. "You what?" the deputy asked, one corner of his mouth tugging upward in a smirk. Marcus met his eyes. "Yes." The deputy scoffed and stepped back out without another word. The door clicked shut again. Silence settled like dust, the kind that fills the lungs and makes you forget what fresh air tastes like. Marcus folded his hands, fingertips pressed together, and slowed his breathing. 1 beat. 2. The technique he taught himself years ago, before oral arguments, before speeches, before sitting on the bench, returned now not as a tool of performance, but of survival. He was a judge, a scholar, a mentor to interns and young lawyers, a son, a husband, a citizen of the very system that had just mistaken him for a threat. But in this room, stripped of titles and context, he was just another man in a holding chair. And that was the bruise that hurt most. Not the cheekbone, not the shoulder, not even the pride. It was the realization that in this country, in this courthouse, in this moment, even being the system wasn't always enough to be safe from it.
By 9:30, the courthouse was fully awake. Elevators pinged, heels echoed, voices bounced between walls lined with oak veneer and bulletin boards. Courtroom 3B, like most in the building, was already half full. A mosaic of defense attorneys in wrinkled suits, prosecutors skimming files, and defendants seated in the back row with their hands folded, eyes scanning for signs of leniency. Folding chairs creaked. Papers shuffled like restless birds. At the front, public defender Sophia Morales sat at her usual spot, flipping through a folder thick with motions and client statements. She was sharp, fast-thinking, and always early. Today, though, she was distracted. She checked her watch, then the bench at the front of the courtroom. Empty. She leaned slightly toward the clerk. "Benji, have you seen Judge Ellison?" Benji Park didn't look up. His thumbs were flying across his phone screen, typing messages with the urgency of someone who knew something wasn't right but didn't yet know how wrong. No reply. He's usually in by now. Someone behind them whispered, "He's never late." Sophia narrowed her eyes. Judge Ellison was known for 3 things: his sharp legal mind, his refusal to tolerate nonsense, and his absolute punctuality. A 9:30 docket meant the first case started at 9:30, not 9:31, ever. Down the hall, in the administrative wing, a door opened with a soft but definitive thud. Captain Jerome Merritt, head of courthouse security, stepped into the holding room with his jaw clenched and shoulders already tense. His eyes scanned the space like he'd walked in late to a fire that had already burned through the floorboards. He saw Marcus Ellison seated in the corner, back straight, hands folded, waiting, not with patience, but with clarity. There was no confusion now, no mistake left to defend. Recognition swept through the captain's face like a jolt.
His voice caught for a second, and then came the flood of half-formed apologies. "Judge Ellison, sir, if you'll just give me a moment to—" "Don't," Marcus said, rising to his feet. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He stood slowly, calmly, without ceremony, as if everything from the last 2 hours had been a bad meeting he was choosing to walk out of. He didn't wait for dignity to be handed back to him, because he had never let it go. He was reclaiming something deeper, the space he belonged in. With the quiet confidence of a man who had walked this hallway for years, Marcus moved past the stunned deputy and out into the corridor. The same corridor where he had been thrown to the ground that morning. The same polished tile that still bore faint traces of where rainwater had mixed with his blood. He didn't look down. He didn't break stride. He walked like a man returning to his post after a storm had passed. As he approached courtroom 3B, the muffled sounds inside began to fade. Time slowed, just slightly. Benji looked up first. His eyes widened. Sophia Morales turned, startled, and stood. The room fell silent. Marcus opened the side door near Chambers, stepped inside, and paused. He reached into the closet behind the bench, removed his judge's robe, deep black, pressed, familiar, and ran a careful hand down its front. No rush, each movement deliberate, like he was putting back on not just fabric, but the authority, integrity, and presence that the morning had tried to strip from him. He stepped forward, adjusted the shoulders of the robe, and took his place at the bench. For a second, no one moved. Then Marcus picked up the gavel. He held it lightly in his hand, the way someone might hold a key, aware of its weight, but knowing exactly where it fit. He brought it down with a single, measured strike. The sound was not loud, but it was final. Not a bang, but a closing. A quiet declaration that something had ended. The chaos, the assumption, the unspoken dismissal of who he was. That version of the morning was over, and a new one had begun. He looked out across the courtroom. "Court is now in session," he said. His voice was level, composed, unmistakable. There was no speech, no dramatic monologue, just presence, the kind that did more than words ever could, the kind that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Hope returned, not as a cheer, but a shift in the air, subtle, stubborn. It crept in like light under a closed door. For those who had watched in silence, unsure of what had happened that morning, it was a correction. For those who had doubted what one moment of injustice could mean, it was a lesson. Marcus Ellison was back on the bench, and this time the system had to look him in the eye.
The wheels of the court turned, almost imperceptibly at first. Judge Marcus Ellison sat tall behind the bench, his robe falling cleanly along his sides, his expression calm and unreadable. On the surface, everything looked normal. Legal language flowed through the courtroom like it did every day. A plea deal entered into the record, a continuance denied, a scheduling order signed. The rhythm of justice carried on, deliberate and impersonal. But beneath the ordinary, tension hummed like a taut wire. The attorneys felt it, the clerks sensed it, even the bailiff stood a little straighter, as if aware that something larger than docket management was unfolding beneath the surface. At precisely 10:17 a.m., Judge Ellison placed his pen down with care, folded his hands, and looked directly at the bailiff. "Mr. Davis," he said, voice calm but unmistakably firm, "please escort Officers Travis Cole and Hank Delaney into the well." A silence followed. Not confusion, recognition. Every ear in the room perked up, eyes widened slightly, chairs shifted. The bailiff nodded and left the room. A moment later, the heavy side door creaked open, and the two officers stepped through. Cole's boots struck the floor with uneven rhythm. Delaney's shoulders were square, but his posture betrayed uncertainty. They weren't in uniform, not fully. Their badges were visible on belts, clipped with habitual pride,
but their demeanor lacked its usual air of command. Now, they were not enforcers, they were summoned. The courtroom watched as they approached the front, the same area where attorneys stood to make motions, where defendants waited to be heard. But this time, it wasn't argument or plea that brought them there. It was accountability. Judge Ellison let the silence breathe, not to intimidate, but to ensure the moment was understood. "State your names for the record," he said evenly. They obeyed, voices quieter than usual. Officer Travis Cole. Officer Hank Delaney. Judge Ellison didn't look down at his notes. He didn't need to. "What occurred on the courthouse steps this morning," he began, "is not merely a matter of miscommunication, nor a routine use of force event. It is a legal concern, a constitutional concern, and a moral concern." His voice didn't rise. If anything, it softened, the kind of tone that demanded attention precisely because it did not seek to overpower. It simply was. "I have reviewed the initial incident," he continued. "I was present for it. I experienced it. And I have full command of the policies you were trained to uphold." He cited the courthouse security memo, line by line, the one he had authored himself, outlining procedures for verifying courthouse personnel before initiating contact. He reminded them of the joint policy adopted between the sheriff's department and the court, that plainclothes judicial officers were not to be detained without confirmation from court staff. He quoted the exact email subject line, "Updated courthouse detention protocol, effective immediately." No theatrics, just facts. "This court finds prima facie grounds," he said, each word deliberate, "to refer this incident to Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal conduct, specifically unlawful detention and use of excessive force under color of authority." Gasps were stifled. Some people looked down, others leaned forward. "Pending that review," Judge Ellison continued, "this court further orders that Officers Cole and Delaney are hereby barred from participating in courtroom duties in this building. Any case in my courtroom involving testimony or involvement from either officer will be continued, reassigned, or reviewed for prejudicial conduct." Cole's face drained of color. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. Delaney opened his mouth first. "Your Honor," he began, voice dry, "we were responding based on a dispatch report. There had been multiple incidents near this location recently. We acted on what we believed to be reasonable suspicion at the time. It wasn't personal." Judge Ellison waited, then looked to Cole. Cole added, "We were under pressure. You know how fast these situations escalate. We thought we were doing the right thing with the information we had." The judge listened without interruption. And then he responded, not with anger, but with clarity. "Intent matters, but in this court, impact rules the day." He let the words settle. "You did not just place your hands on a judge. You placed your hands on the idea that someone who looks like me does not belong in the place I serve. And whether or not that was your intention, it was the result." A beat passed. No one moved. You challenged the presumption that blackness can exist in authority without explanation. You confirmed a fear that many carry, that no title, no education, no position is ever enough to override a quick judgment. His voice was still low, but no one dared to breathe. "This is not about vengeance," he said. "This is about integrity, both yours and mine, and this institution's." Behind him, the seal of the state of Riverton gleamed against polished wood. Above it, the words "Equal Justice Under Law" were carved in deep, bold letters. Today, those words were not decoration. They were responsibility. He didn't bang the gavel. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned to the clerk. "Let the record reflect the record. Internal Affairs and the DA's office will receive full transcripts by end of day." Then to the courtroom. We will resume the morning calendar. The tension in the room broke, not with applause, not with gasps, but with a collective exhale. The kind of breath people take when a line has been drawn and drawn cleanly. Triumph didn't arrive like thunder. It came in precise language, in upheld protocol, in the visible return of balance. And when Marcus Ellison picked up his pen again, the sound of it moving across the paper felt like the continuation of something larger than one moment, the quiet, determined march of justice.
Not every echo is loud. Some arrive quietly, through policies rewritten in quiet rooms, through awkward training sessions no one wants to attend, through subtle changes in who speaks first and who listens better. These aren't moments that go viral. They're not built for headlines. But they change things, especially mornings. By the end of that month, a new protocol was posted inside every entrance of the Riverton County Courthouse. A simple notice, printed on plain paper, with a heading that read, "Revised Entry Procedures, effective immediately." From now on, courthouse security would handle all first contact engagements within the perimeter. Patrol units were to observe, not intervene, unless there was an active, immediate threat. The policy didn't name anyone. It didn't have to. Everyone who worked in the building knew why it existed. Scenario-based trainings were updated. A new module was added to the academy curriculum, Bias at Thresholds. It focused not on split-second decisions, but on the half-second assumptions that come before them. The ones that follow someone from the parking lot to the metal detector, shaped by skin, posture, and silence. Officers had to walk those same steps in simulations now, as others watched. Power wasn't removed, it was made visible, and with visibility came responsibility. Officer Cole requested a transfer. No public statement, no resignation, just a quiet form signed and submitted. A few weeks later, he was reassigned to the department's Community Outreach Division. He started working with at-risk youth. It wasn't a redemption arc, and he didn't pretend it was. But he showed up, he listened more than he spoke. Officer Delaney stayed. At first, he sat in the back of every implicit bias workshop with arms crossed and eyes skeptical, the posture of resistance. But over time, the arms softened, the questions came. Not all of them were comfortable. That was the point. Internal Affairs completed its review. The findings were made public. The consequences were clear and specific, not just for those involved, but as a precedent for the future. Transparency replaced silence. And for some, like Public Defender Sophia Morales, the moment stayed pinned to the wall. Not as a victory, but as a reminder. The printed court order, slightly curled at the corners, hung just above her desk. It wasn't framed, it wasn't sacred, but every time a new client came in feeling like the system would never see them clearly, she looked up and remembered that sometimes, just sometimes, it does. As for Judge Ellison, he stayed exactly where he was. He kept the robe, he kept the schedule, he kept the standard. And he kept the scar. Not visible, not talked about, but real. A reminder that justice isn't immune to injustice. That titles don't shield you from being mistaken for less than you are. But how you respond to that mistake can define what happens next. On certain mornings, he still took the same rideshare, got out at the same spot, walked the same steps where it had all happened. Sometimes the light would hit the stone just right, and he'd see the faint line where the grout still bore the stain, scrubbed clean but not forgotten. He didn't look back to remember. He paused to measure the distance between that morning and this one, between who held the power and who was finally asked to hold it with care. Inspiration didn't come in speeches or verdicts. It came in subtler things. A door held open by a uniform. A courtroom starting on time. A young intern realizing that their future had room in it for justice, not just the word, but the practice.
And maybe most of all, it came in a truth that no longer needed to be proven in pain. This place, this building, this bench, this system belongs to all of us. Not someday, not conditionally, starting now.